Welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management Webinar Series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen. I'm the Program Manager for the Recycling Market Center and will serve as your moderator today. The focus on today's webinar is on used clothing recovery. Our presenters today are Jackie King and Ira Baseman, who I will introduce in a moment. Following their presentations, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the Q&A feature box located on your control panel on your screen. You may also use the chat feature to request assistance if you're experiencing technical difficulties during the webinar. Please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites. The presentation slides can also be obtained using the handout feature on your webinar control panel. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters. Jackie King has worked in association management for 17 years, encompassing leadership roles in project and program management, strategic planning and implementation, administrative management, budgeting and financial management, meeting and event management, and communications on behalf of nonprofit trade associations. She has been the executive director for the Secondary Materials and Recycled Clothing Association, also known as S.M.A.R.T, since 2009. She has participated in media relations and crisis management training on behalf of S.M.A.R.T and has become the spokesperson for the association, participating in multiple media interviews on S.M.A.R.T's behalf. She's a member of the Maryland Bar and is an active member of the American Society of Executives. She's a past chair of the Association of Education Alliance and the Small Business Legislative Council, known as the SBLC. So for Ira, inspired by the mission of doing well and doing good in business, entrepreneur Ira Baseman founded Community Recycling, a socially and environmentally conscious for-profit clothing recycling company in 2001. With the establishment of Retail Thrift Operation Philadelphia, he discovered the powerful personal connections that happen through clothing recycling. Upon the sale of the store to Goodwill Industries, Ira launched Community Recycling with the desire to disrupt the traditional thinking of the 3 R's. He's been on a simple but ambitious mission to create personal connections through recycling. Community Recycling engages more than 5,000 partner organizations in the U.S. and more than 50 countries in the reuse movement by recycling or repurposing materials, helping to grow local economies and provide jobs for people in the U.S. and around the world. Prior to founding Community Recycling, Ira enjoyed a career as a corporate attorney in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia with a focus on contracts and commercial real estate development. He left the law to join a leading builder of luxury homes and contribute to its national growth by opening new markets around the country. Thereafter, Ira founded a venture-backed technology firm that was part of the early .com revolution and which was sold to a large competitor. Ira earned his bachelor's degree in political science and philosophy from George Washington University and his JD from the George Washington University Law School. Okay, we're going to have Jackie up first, and the screen is yours.
All right, thanks so much, Wayne, for the invitation. I think I participated in a similar webinar to this with Ira probably 5 years ago. So things have changed a bit with textile reuse and recycling. I'm going to focus more on kind of an overall view of what textile reuse and recycling means, a little bit about the markets and the global influence that has really impacted how the business is operated. A little bit about S.M.A.R.T. We've been around or the association in some different names, not always called S.M.A.R.T, since 1932. All our members are for-profit used clothing, wiping material, and fiber companies. We have approximately 150 companies worldwide, and our members reuse and recycle all types of clothing, apparel, and textiles. I've worked with S.M.A.R.T for 10 years now, so I have a knowledge that is a mile wide and maybe an inch deep, but I do have a pretty good perspective on what our members do, not down in the trenches with them every day because I'm not an industry professional. Today's definition, just for people who maybe aren't that familiar, accessible things that are textiles that can be recycled, any clothing, household textile, or commercial linen. Textile, as long as it's clean, dry, and has no odor, can be reused and recycled. We also say that, as long as it doesn't have any hazardous materials on it as well, which would be the same thing as it being clean, dry, and no odor. Our members, some of them are involved in the pre-consumer side of the industry where they're getting materials from textile or fiber companies, repurposing them into different products. It could be wiping cloths, it could be insulation for cars or home, padding for carpets, stuffing for pillows, that kind of thing. Then there's the post-consumer market. So after the consumer has used a product, our members acquire textiles from all kinds of sources, a variety of them, charities, for example, like Goodwill, Salvation Army. They also, many of them have their own collection bins where they're collecting. And sometimes they're getting them from commercial areas or, for example, hospitals or hotels that maybe have excess linen, sheets, towels, those kinds of things that are worn or stained, but they could be reused. So with clothing, once that clothing is graded, it can be reused or recycled. A lot of that terminology gets kind of an interchangeable terminology, but our members mostly are on the used clothing side of things. It's a reuse. And then a lot of the materials, if they can't be used as clothing, can be cut up and made into wiping rags. And then some of those post-consumer materials are then could also go back into the fiber conversion part of the market. Just overall, where do reused and recycled textiles go? About 45% go in the reuse side of things as clothing or apparel. About 30% are cut up and made into wiping rags or polishing cloths that are used in a lot of industries. And then about 20% gets ground up into fibers and then are used to create new products. And as I mentioned, things like insulation, carpet padding, stuffing for bedding and pillows. Some items that are acceptable to reuse, it's the whole laundry list, variety of things. A lot of times people don't, think about certain items that could be reused or recycled, but it's pretty much the whole gamut of things, again, as long as they're clean and dry and they don't have any hazardous materials on them. As I mentioned earlier, the use of the term recycling within our industry, it can be things like reuse and recycle kind of interchangeably. I tend to think of the used clothing side of things really as the reuse side. Wiping rags similarly, although it is kind of a recycle if it's cut up and made into something else. And the fiber materials obviously are recycled and made into a completely different product from what they originally started out as. There's a lot of great benefits to people reusing recycling textiles. The most recent EPA, this was in 2014, EPA does a study annually of the composition of materials that go into landfills, and they've done analysis of the greenhouse gas benefits. So textiles is up there pretty high compared to a lot of other things that are thought of as recyclable more than textiles are. So it's equivalent to removing 1.3 million cars from the road as far as a greenhouse gas benefit. So it's pretty impressive, the impact of being able to do that. And if you think about all the water that's used in the manufacture of making new clothing and energy and electricity, that's where a lot of the benefits come from. The most recent EPA report is from 2015, and in that analysis, it said that 16.2 million tons of textiles were discarded in landfills. Only about 2.45 million tons were reused or recycled. And that's still the breakdown that we've talked about ever since I've worked with S.M.A.R.T for the past 10 years, is that about 85% of clothing and textiles are discarded and about 15% are reused or recycled. So it's still not a big recycling and reuse rate, and we believe there's an opportunity certainly for things to improve. And in the composition study that they do to see what ends up in the landfill, about 7.6% is textiles, and that's actually gone up from prior years. Prior years it was in the like 6.5%. So unfortunately, it's not getting better. It seems to be getting worse. And I know Ira's going to speak a little bit about, you know, the circular economy and fast fashion. I think a lot of it has to do with, you know, some of the quality of clothing that we have, as well as the consumer buying a lot more of materials that are not of the best quality to be recycled. And when you break it all down, that's about 85 pounds per person that's thrown away annually in the United States. So that's just it's a sad number. It's something that we have, as an organization, tried to work on educating the public about what can be reused and recycled, and that there is a use for a lot of these materials that people are otherwise getting rid of. A little bit about the global market. Used clothing accounts for just about 0.5% of global trade in clothing. So it's, you know, it's not certainly as much as the new clothing industry. About 30% of those materials are imported into sub-Saharan Africa, and that is one of the largest importing areas in the world. About 20 to 30% of those materials stay here stay in North America, so that's US and Canada combined, and it's consumed by the thrift industry and, you know, the variety of used goods retail industry. And in 2018, about 1.6 billion pounds were exported to a variety of countries. Some of the sorting and grading of clothing that is collected here in the United States gets exported to Canada, but a lot of it goes now to other countries to be sorted and graded. And by that I mean that once clothing is collected, it needs to get sorted into the various types, sizes, you know, products that consumers would want in whatever destination that they're bound for. So countries like India, Pakistan, Dubai is not a country, Jackie, it's United Arab Emirates, but also South American countries like Guatemala and Chile are doing a lot of the grading, sorting, and processing of those materials that used to take place here in the United States or in Canada. Once all of those are processed, they're then sent to a variety of countries. As I mentioned, Africa, a big destination, but also Asia, South America, and other places where secondhand is an important source of affordable clothing because a lot of the consumers there are not able to afford new clothing. Here's just a graphic, and you know, you'll get this in your materials about you know, this particular session that just kind of gives you the life cycle of where clothing goes and the percentages. And we have this available on our website as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, challenges of reuse and recycling of textiles, and I'm thinking of this more from a community perspective in, you know, to the Pennsylvania or other places. I know there's people that have tuned into this webinar from all over. I think a lot of people wonder, why can't I recycle this stuff with my other recycling? Well, a lot of the problem is keeping it clean and dry for curbside pickup. And there are communities that have done this. I know Ira has some past experience of doing that. But again, it is, you know, usually not on a huge scale because you do have to have special bags for people to do that. The other thing is that normally people aren't, you know, putting reuse and recycling textile materials out on a weekly basis like you would with your normal recyclables. So there's not necessarily as much volume as would be with those other materials. And again, it's not going to go in a bin with the other materials because you need to keep it clean and dry. And I think certainly some of the issues that have been raised with single stream recycling, and also when you look at what China has done with some of the bans with recyclables coming from the US and other countries, is because those materials have gotten contaminated and don't have, you know, the value. I know when Wayne spoke to me about participating in this webinar, he asked if that had any impact on my members, and really it didn't, because China has never allowed used clothing to come into the country. So that was not a problem for my members, but I know certainly for a lot of recycling companies, certainly members of the NRC, it was a big problem. And the other challenge for curbside, or getting communities to get on board with this, is that most of the companies in the textile reuse and recycling industry are smaller companies or regional players. So to really make this in a bigger scale, it's difficult for that to happen. I think it is certainly something that's doable, and partnering on a smaller scale with cities and towns, or even on a state level, to work with companies that are able to do that kind of collection. But I think on a national scale, it would be hard to manage. Again, some things I think it's important to note about from a solid waste reuse and recycling perspective about textiles is that usually our main requirement is just that things are clean and dry. So there's not a lot of educating about sorting materials out, as long as it meets those requirements. A lot of times the used clothing has a higher value compared to other recyclables. So from a perspective of, say, a city or town that's thinking about, well, I'd like to partner with somebody to do these kinds of collections, usually the value is going to be, you're going to get more from those companies for clothing than you would for bottles or cans. And we have found that a lot of cities and towns, and maybe it's not so much true if there's been a lot of cuts with budgets, but that communities are looking for ways to recycle these materials. I think I see a lot of interest in food composting, because food waste is such a big part of what ends up in the waste stream. And when you think about 7% of landfill waste being made up of clothing and textiles, this is another big opportunity. And the fact that about 95% of these materials can be reused or recycled, as long as they're in good shape from a clean and dry perspective. And our members have been doing this for generations. Many of our members have been in this industry for a long time, and the markets already know how to take care of the materials, so there's markets in place for that. Some things, and I think Ira maybe is going to talk a little bit more about this, so I won't spend a lot of time, but the big thing that people talk about now are the circular economy and the end of life for these materials. What happens when it is finally the end for an item of clothing or a textile? There is some new technology out there that's looking at ways to take the materials and separate the fibers out if they're a blend, and that is really one of the barriers right now to taking something that's a polyester cotton blend and making it into a new fiber. As I said, there's technology in the works on that, but it's not available yet, and certainly not on a mass market. There are also some new sorting capabilities where they can detect the type of material that is in a garment, and that would really make things more valuable, because then it would allow for certain things to get segregated in a way that would be better from a reuse and recycling perspective. But again, those technologies at this point are still not necessarily a cost-effective way of doing that. The other thing that's a challenge is that there is a major shift in where, as I mentioned earlier, the clothes are sorted, graded, and processed outside of North America into these other countries. So it is really a shifting of a market for where the materials are going. You're still going to get predominantly the collections of these materials here in the US and Canada, certainly in parts of Europe. Going to be the main collection points, but where it's sorted and graded to then ultimately go to the consumer, there has been a big change in that. One of the things I'll talk a little bit about, and then I'm almost done and turn it over to Ira, is one of the barriers or concerns we have from my members' perspectives, or bans or restrictions that are being imposed on the importation of used clothing in a lot of the countries that my members traditionally sell into. In 2017, the East African Community countries, or the EAC, proposed a ban on secondhand clothing. As an organization, S.M.A.R.T works very closely with the United States government, particularly the U.S. Trade Rep's office, before the ban went into effect, to try to convince the East African community that this was not a good idea from the perspective of an agreement that they had signed with the U.S. It's called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, to work with the U.S. To eliminate barriers to trade. In exchange for that, they would get duty-free access to the United States to sell their products. So by working with the government and petitioning for a review of their benefits, we were successful with help from the government in getting 4 out of 5 of the East African community countries not to ban the importation of those goods. And that was very important for my members, because about 21% of the clothing that, and textiles that they were exporting went to those countries. Rwanda went ahead and moved forward with the ban. So we have heard there that they still have used clothing for sale there. It's just now being smuggled in. But people still have a need for the clothing, because, again, it's affordable for what their constituents need. One recent challenge we have is Uganda, which is a part of the EAC, is considering restrictions on the importation of used shoes. And the restrictions are such that, in essence, they would be a ban. So we have just recently filed some comments with the WTO to make them aware that, you know, these restrictions could be in violation of not just AGOA, but some WTO requirements. And then finally, just recently, Costa Rica had just considered imposing some new laundry restrictions, basically like requiring anyone selling used clothing to launder at such a high temperature that they would have ruined most of the clothing. And they also did not have facilities that were able to wash clothing at such a high temperature. So in our work with some of our members and their customers, they were able to persuade the Costa Rican government to review that decision, because it did not really make sense, and it was not something based in any kind of a health regulation, which was really what they were saying, that was necessary for them to do that. So, you know, as an organization, one of the things we've been trying to be vigilant on is, you know, helping where we can to stop bans from going in place, or restrictions that would be in essence a ban. Our biggest problem is in countries where the bans were already in existence, to try to overcome that. But it is something that we've advocated for the last, you know, many years actually. But most recently with this ban in EAC. And that's all I have. And I'm certainly happy to take questions at the end, and have Ira take over.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Jackie, for that great presentation. Okay, Ira, you're up. Ira does not have a slide deck, so he's just going to be chatting. But I do have a slide of his photo and some contact information. So I'll pull it up momentarily. I do apologize for the first couple slides on Jackie's presentation did not show up, but I think we took care of that glitch. So we will fix that during our editing of the webinar, so you'll be able to see that presentation in full once we get the edited version up on our websites. So Ira, you're up.
Thank you very much, Wayne, and thank you, Jackie. Again, my name is Ira Baseman. I am the president of Community Recycling. We have been in the clothing recycling world for the past 18 years, and have been along a journey that has brought us to a very interesting place in time in the clothing recycling world that I want to address today. One of the sort of overarching opportunities and movements that is taking place in the clothing recycling world is regarded as the circular economy, and how that impacts on the fashion industry and clothing recycling in particular is what I'd like to talk about this afternoon. I want to reframe the problem first and just highlight some important facts and figures that really explain the extent and scope and somewhat, the tragedy of what we are dealing with in the clothing recycling industry as it relates to the fashion industry. The first and most important number that really is, sort of palpable is that as a country, the United States alone is responsible for producing 26 billion pounds of post-consumer textile waste. That's clothing, shoes, household items, etc. Every year, 26 billion pounds of materials is discarded into the waste stream, only 15% of which is regarded as recycled. That is a number that unfortunately is projected to continue to rise. That is a number that we have seen as an industry, both as a tragedy and really as an opportunity, because that material is the sort of the lifeblood of the clothing recycling world, and serves as an opportunity to find the highest and best recovery, whether in whatever form that may take, whether it is recycling for reuse, remanufacturing, or other purposes. There are a number of recent stories that have been written about the fashion industry, and it's been disputed, but one of the sort of highlights of what has been produced in terms of documentaries and the like is that the fashion industry represents the second largest polluter in the world, against the oil industry as number one. It is a fact that the fashion industry is just recently starting to embrace and understand. And in light of a number of changes within the fashion industry, most importantly, the rise of direct-to-consumer brands, that is, those brands that have taken advantage of the technology of the internet to deal directly with consumers, we are now seeing a significant shift, I think it's safe to say, in those fashion brands as it relates to consumers' attention and accountability around that fact. The fashion industry is not certainly alone in the contribution to this problem. A couple of other important facts. 3/5 of all clothing items will end up in a landfill within 1 year after being produced. Number two, it is estimated that people wear clothing, that the use or utility of clothing is dropping rapidly. That is that clothing utilization has decreased by 36% compared to about 15 years ago. That means we're buying a lot more and wearing a lot less. The consumer, at the same time, is regarded as being a lot more aware and a lot more involved in thinking about not only where their clothing is coming from as it relates to these direct-to-consumer brands, as we've seen a considerable amount of transparency in the production and the sourcing of materials, but now consumers are paying a lot more attention to sustainability generally. It's estimated that 60% of millennials say that they want to shop more sustainably, and that fashion brands are responsible to bring this solution to the customer. So what we're seeing in many pieces of these facts, and what we're seeing in the changes of technology, in the way that brands are communicating and relating to their customers, is a shift. It's a shift around the attitudes around sustainability. It's a shift around what it means to be involved in consumption, and what happens to that item once it's been purchased. So the overarching movement that we've seen arise in the last 3 to 5 years has been regarded as the circular economy. The circular economy was really put out into the public domain by Ellen MacArthur. Ellen MacArthur is from the UK. She came back from a sailing venture around the world, having witnessed pollution in the oceans, and recognized that her mission really was to change the way we consume. And so, together with a number of very powerful brands and people across the world, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been responsible primarily for promoting this idea of the circular economy. And the circular economy basically stands for 3 very important principles. And certainly one of the most important industries that the circular economy has been focused on is the fashion industry. So number 1, it's about designing product to design out waste. It means thinking about products from the first instance and thinking about how they will be used, how they will be managed, and how they will be disposed of, and what's the proper life cycle of that product. So it's really about design first. The second is durability, is how long are these items going to be used, and how can brands really build a better product? That is an issue that sort of runs counter to this whole fast fashion movement, but a number of brands are taking a very different perspective around durability. And then finally, it is about regeneration. Circular economy means thinking differently about the progression of make, use, and discard. It's really about making, using, and regenerating to keep the raw material flow limited, and recycling for reuse, or reclamation for remanufacturing, however you would describe it, taking those articles back into the manufacturing process and improving the system totally. So the circular economy, as it relates to the fashion industry, has really been really a powerful movement. And a number of brands, whether because they believe they have to, or because they believe it's a good idea, have been trumpeting the importance of the circular economy and really promoting different initiatives, whether around design or around take-back strategies or around recycling technologies, all of these things to really begin to see the world a little differently. And while it may be early on in this movement, the circular economy as it relates to the fashion industry is a reality that's not going away. And sustainability generally in fashion as it relates to recycling is not going away. Why is this happening? What's the benefit to the brand? What's the benefit to the consumer? Well, first and foremost, the brand, because of the speed at which they are communicating and relating to their customers, are taking steps in the consumer's eyes to do something more and to change the way that they are responsible for that product. And by consequence, brands are building a stronger bond with their customer. So brand loyalty is very important as part of this process. Second, brands in this new age of direct-to-consumer engagement have an opportunity to build data and profiles around consumer recycling behavior, around the use and utility and durability of products. Brands are now getting reports back in this process about how products are being used, what can be improved, how things can be changed to handle this new effort to reduce the impact to our environment, which is certainly the point of this whole exercise. It's about building a conservation effort around an item that we've taken for granted for so long and discarded for so long. So conservation is definitely an issue. Beyond that, we're also looking at brands that are reevaluating product design. In the recent last couple of months, we've seen brands such as Adidas and Converse and some Eileen Fisher and Patagonia certainly promoting the products that are coming out of recycled product, whether it's plastics or whether it's reclaimed textiles. We're talking about products that are actually beginning to use recycled materials as part of the design, as part of the product itself. And so brands are stepping up. It's small and important, but it's definitely I believe, a telltale sign of the direction we're headed. Insofar as what other benefits accrue to the brand, it's also been proven in surveys that employees love working for brands that are doing better and feel proud of the work that these brands are doing. And so it builds a better system, it builds a better environment within the company to talk about, to actually do this good work. So the brands are benefiting. What's the benefit of the circular economy to the consumer? Well, we're talking about products. Let me, before I even get into what the benefits are, let's talk about the shift of what's happening in the marketplace as it relates to product and as it relates to clothing in particular. We have seen with the onset of readily available apps, we have seen a shift in consumer behavior as it relates to ownership. Consumers are no longer pushing to own products. They're interested in access to products. And that takes the shape, whether it's an Uber or an Airbnb, or as it relates to clothing, subscription or rental services, or leasing jeans, or all sorts of different programs that allow for a limited accessibility and ownership has been subordinated. Now we're talking about just a use and reuse of that product. So as it relates to the consumer, the circular economy has the benefits of providing different options about how to engage with clothing. It talks about different types of product that incorporates sustainability in the design. And it also allows for a relationship between the brand and the consumer that promotes a convenient and simple solution to a long-standing problem around clothing recycling. And that is, where does my stuff go once I'm done with it? How do I deal with that issue? Because that, as Jackie alluded to in her conversation about different methods of textile recycling, it's really about awareness, and it's about, most importantly, it's about convenience. And how to recycle is really one of the major benefits of this new circular economy movement back to the consumer. Because now we have solutions that are geared towards people that are easier to use and simpler, and actually come with rewards in many cases. So I want to turn now to a couple of more specific ideas around post-consumer options. What happens to clothing? What are the options that we now enjoy? What do these programs look like? What are their benefits? What are their drawbacks? In the sort of the early days of clothing recycling, it was really primarily driven by just a couple of different options. But today the options are very different. I'm going to just list them out for a moment. So first we have donation. Second, we have sort of the traditional industry of clothing recycling that Jackie spoke to, mostly international distribution and trade. 3, we have re-commerce. And 4, we have pure recycling. So I want to talk a little bit about those 4 as it relates to the sort of the new world that we're living in, and how brands and consumers are participating differently, and what we think this world will look like as it unfolds in the next couple of years. Because I do believe that we are at an inflection point in the clothing recycling industry. For the reasons that I touched on. One, we're talking about a technological shift in the way people engage with brands and how they relate to the clothing they buy. 2, it is about clothing is no longer a simple commodity. It is a valuable item that collects data. It's a valuable item that has utility, hopefully for much longer. And it's an item that can be passed on for reuse or for remanufacturing of some kind or another. So let me go through those 4 different post-consumer destinations. Let's talk about donation first. Traditionally, and this goes back largely to the benefit of Goodwill, Salvation Army, St. Vincent de Paul, and the like, these organizations were largely responsible for socializing recycling or putting recycling into the sort of social culture in a way that was very different. Clothing recycling as an industry dates back, hundreds and hundreds of years, but it was Salvation Army and Goodwill in particular that really used the donation model to put clothing recycling sort of on the map, and used donations as a means of funding programs for their institutions, all of which are for social good. The donation model is still very prominent, and it is a model that I think will continue. Donations are, while certainly have a not just a charitable component, they do typically provide a convenient solution for most consumers. It's often the case that Salvation Army or Goodwill will do a house-to-house pickup or provide an easy way of collection. Recently, however, we've seen the limits or the strain, I would say, on the donation system. With the rise of Marie Kondo and the fascination that everybody now seems to have with decluttering and minimalization, we've seen lots of charities overwhelmed with donations and incapable really of managing the flow of all of these discards that are now being put into the waste stream. And in many cases, even though Goodwill and Salvation Army are multi-billion-dollar institutions, these companies or these organizations are not very well suited to manage that influx of material. They have rudimentary systems in many cases and are not really well positioned to handle that flow. Donations still persist and will continue. A lot of the organizations are doing what they can to change the way they handle donations. They've become a lot more discriminating as to what they will take and when they will take it. So it does provide some pause as to what impact that will have on the rest of the industry. I'm going to turn to the domestic and international recycling, which Jackie spoke about. Other than donations, there's been a rise over the last probably the last 20 plus years of for-profit recycling companies like my own, where we have gone out into the community as a for-profit enterprise and have done our best to provide an alternative to the donation system and provide consumers with a convenient and simple solution, whether it's curbside, whether it's donation bins, or whether or house-to-house pickups. The traditional recycling model of collection and either grading or sorting or distribution is still existent. It is a model that I believe needs to be reconsidered, and I've been working hard at it for quite some time. But both the donation model and the traditional recycling model as endpoints for post-consumer product are really limited because we don't get much data. We don't get much of an experience for the recycler. Certainly it's a convenient solution. Certainly it provides a way of moving product out of the house into another vehicle, but it is not by any stretch of the imagination the most effective way of managing the process. Also, as Jackie alluded, the international markets for recycling have been impacted by cultural issues, by trade, by value of the dollar, certainly more recently with tariffs. And these barriers have really in some way hampered the improvements that we've been seeking to make in traditional clothing recycling. Recommerce. Recommerce is a term of art that has recently come into sort of the modern parlance. It's really just about resale. And what is fascinating about resale or recommerce is that this has been a burgeoning development in clothing recycling that I think is quite impressive. Many of you probably are familiar with eBay, certainly, but there have been over the last several years a number of online, primarily, applications, ThreadUp, The RealReal, Poshmark, Mercury, Depop, just to name a few. These online programs allow for either consignment or direct resale of clothing, shoes, and accessories from person to person. There's been an explosion in that market. It is estimated to be about $24 billion market right now, and projections have it that it will be triple in size in the next 10 years or so. It's also estimated to be growing 21 times faster than traditional retail. And that is a huge wake-up call to this industry. And when I'm talking about this industry, I'm talking about the fashion industry, I'm talking about clothing recycling industry. The resale economy is here to stay. People have become a lot more capable and comfortable buying and selling used clothing, shoes, and accessories in minutes on their smartphones. And it is re-commerce that is going to change, I believe, the face of clothing recycling, if it hasn't already. So what has happened in the last couple of years, in particular, is that brands are starting to wake up and realize that they have an opportunity to participate in this resale economy. Because once an item is sold, typically they have no, or have not had, a vested interest in the second life or the redistribution of that article. Well, that all has changed. First with Patagonia, second with Eileen Fisher, now with a number of other brands that are out there participating in programs that allow for brands to re-engage customers, take back articles either in store or online in a convenient and simple way, often with a reward of a discount or some kind of coupon, and allow for those consumers to conveniently recycle, take the product back to the brand or to the third-party vendor that's performing this service, and those articles are resold in a new marketplace, online typically, with the proceeds going back to the brand. And the consumer is rewarded by having enjoyed the relationship with that brand, allowed for that article to be reused, and continues to buy and support that brand. So the resale economy within the recycling industry is growing. There's all sorts of different programs that are out there now that brands are invited to consider as to how this works, but there's a myriad of benefits that flow from resale. It's new revenue, it's new data, it's brand loyalty, it's a new relationship with the product. But there are limitations, of course. Not every article can be resold. Not every article is valuable enough in its afterlife. So it's not a cure-all, but it's definitely an option for many of the articles that we buy and consume and use today. So resale is going to continue. I think it's, we're already seeing major brands entertaining ideas around it, and this is going to further sort of advance the idea of different ways of recycling clothing and related items. The last piece of this puzzle is pure recycling. as Jackie touched upon, pure recycling of textile product is happening. There are a handful of companies, including Evernew, Renewcell, Worn Again, just to name a couple, that are pioneering new technologies, whether with chemicals or mechanical or some combination of the two, to take clothing, mostly, and restore it back to original fiber or raw fiber for remanufacturing. This is been done. It's been proven. There have been a couple of recent small lots of clothing that have been produced using these methods, but it's largely limited to a single fabric product, in particular cotton, and it's still not at commercial scale. I think we are seeing, signs of growth, and brands are most interested in looking at how they can participate, but it's growing incrementally. I will add, however, that there is sort of a related concept to pure recycling, and that's remanufacturing. That is taking an article, cutting it up, and using some piece of it or some pieces of it to remake or recreate a new article completely. And the most recent example of that is a relationship that was struck couple 3 years ago with one of the members of S.M.A.R.T. That has taken reclaimed denim and has cut a deal with Converse to make new sneakers with that reclaimed denim. That's an example of remanufacturing or upcycling that is very promising. So there are new and different options that have been sort of simmering for some time, some of which are really taking great hold insofar as re-commerce is concerned, and recycling and remanufacturing. We see the technology advancements, changing the face of clothing recycling. It's an industry that does not move very quickly, and so consequently, some of these steps, happen from outside, and some of these things are happening with the benefit of organizations like the MacArthur Foundation. But I think there's no question that we are in the midst of change. And while change can be challenging at times, it's certainly promising. And the opportunities are there to see different ways that we relate to our fashion brands, and different ways that we relate to the clothing that we wear and the shoes that we wear. So I'm excited about the prospects for the future. It is it's still not clear where everything will go, but I'm convinced that we are seeing some really interesting new developments that will take us to a different place. And this is not unique to the United States. Actually, the U.S. is somewhat further behind than some of our European friends, but this is an issue that's out in front and people are paying attention to. So with that, I will look forward to good things to come.
All right, thank you, Ira. Another great presentation. So we're now going to field some questions from the audience or comments. So again, if you have a question or comment, use the Q&A feature on your control panel. So we've had some questions and comments from early on. So probably the ones I'm going to talk about now are probably geared towards Jackie, but Ira, you can also comment also.
Sure.
So Jackie, you still there?
I'm still here.
Okay, good. So this question has to do with the person does donate to Goodwill, but the question is, can the industry use polyester fabrics like open weave shirts and socks, or is it cotton? can be used?
Sure. Yeah. So our members, as I mentioned previously, if it's got a reuse as clothing, absolutely, different polyester materials are a whole part of that. The challenge, I think as Ira touched on a little bit is, when things have a polyester blend, when you're going to try to grind it up and make it into something else or respin it into a new yarn, that's what I was trying to explain. But basically the reuse for clothing, yeah, all the blends and basically any kind of apparel that's, doesn't have an odor, it's clean and dry. If it doesn't have a tear in it, it could be resold as clothing. The blend doesn't matter. The problem with the blends is again, when you're trying to break it down and then spin it into a yarn to make it into a new fabric, that can be challenging. There are companies that are, grinding up, polyester blends and making them into other things. But I would say that a lot of that fiber conversion, they do tend to like the more virgin fibers, like 100% cotton, but it just depends on what product is being made. So I hope that answers the question.
Sure. And a follow-up, what about textiles that are stained but have been washed? So they are clean.
Right. Yeah, so if they have a stain in them, then that would be the use for a wiping rag. Could be cut up and made into a wiping rag, depending on what the composition of that is. So yeah, absolutely, if it's got a stain or a tear in it, that's where we say there's 30% of those kinds of materials get made into wiping rags.
Right, or insulation or other.
Or insulation, yes, if they're ground up.
Right.
Yep, 20% in that use.
Regarding the clothing, that they'll be secondhand from the brands, what kind of condition do they want them in? And this person says, from what I've encountered, is that they want something that's up to date, only months or a year old. If you have something older or out of style, they don't want to offer anything for it.
Right. Well, it depends on if you're, some of the consignment operations like ThreadUp and the Real have very strict, or I should say, very strong limits on what they will accept. And that's largely because they're focused on handling a product that has a higher resale value. If you're talking about brands that are promoting recycling and take back on its own, for its own purpose, and we're doing work here with, like, for example, Timberland is one of our partners. There is just an expectation of being gently used. So the limitations by the brands are typically lower than the consignment operations.
Okay.
And I would just interject that, a lot of times, if you're talking about for, thrift, consignment, or vintage, I mean, vintage is big with a lot of millennials and young people. And so, the fact that something's, 10 years old is more appealing to them, perhaps, than something that's a year old. It just depends on what they're interested in.
Right.
Okay. There's this attendee mentions about a company called Simple Recycling, who's a private venture that contracts with municipalities for curbside pickup. You see that trend continuing in the country?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, the engagement of third-party operators to do the work on behalf of the municipality, whether it be like Simple, which does house-to-house pickups, or some other collection method, is not going away, and it's definitely a good model. That model, however, depends on these markets remaining open and viable. That is because Simple Recycling and other traditional recycling companies, even such as our own, depend on those international markets largely today for profit. And that, so long as that market continues, and it will mostly, it's just a matter of making sure that our trade is open.
Right. Jackie mentioned the China issue. The textiles already have been banned there, but does that make it more of an important reason for communities to focus on textiles, as a lot of it is going to domestic outlets? And don't textiles help with affordability for U.S. residents as well?
Sure, and certainly I think that, as I mentioned with millennials, but, as Ira mentioned too, one of our members is ThreadUp, but he mentioned some of these other online consignment type stores is what I'd call them, or whatever, re-commerce, like The Real, and there's a whole variety of them. That has become very popular because it is more affordable, and it's certainly not just younger millennials, but a lot of people have become much more concerned about sustainability, end of life, our mass consumerization of all things, but a lot of clothing, that, why not get something that is in good shape, but secondhand and at a very affordable price.
Yeah, let me add, if I may, just two points. One, and this is relating to the China question, if you want to phrase it that way. But from an international trade standpoint, China does very strongly impact on our industry, certainly as U.S. exporters of clothing. As China has grown, they continued to discard a considerable amount of material, and they have been competing pretty significantly in a number of the markets that Jackie mentioned, where we sell gently used clothing. One of the major advantages that we enjoy as a country, however, and as a consumer culture, is that the quality standards that we enjoy for even product that's made in the Asian markets is significantly higher than that which is produced within China for its own consumers. So quality does count, even by default. If it's made for the U.S. market, it's typically regarded as a better end use and a better end value.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Ira, and you're absolutely right. Our members have seen a lot of Chinese new clothing flooding markets where our members are selling used clothing, and
right.
It is a quality issue because it may look like, oh great, this is new and I can afford this, but if it doesn't last more than one washing, that's not affordable to people who are living very much, not necessarily on but it's certainly a different standard of living than what we would have an expectation for here.
Right.
What are the best policies and programs that communities have adopted that could help expand textile recycling? Is there a need for what's this reuse warehouse in capitalized letters to help with the flow of materials both in and out?
Well, I guess I would start by saying that municipalities and communities generally have the best opportunity to promote awareness around textile recycling, and it is often the case that communities enjoy the closest relationship with the residents, and it's about starting with education and making sure that people are aware that there are options for easy and convenient recycling solutions. Going to the level of what vehicle that the community uses, whether it's bins in the park or at the library, or whether it's engaging companies like Simple to do house-to-house pickups, or some other variation on that, is an open question, certainly. But communities enjoy, and that's where sustainability happens first. It's really at the local level. It's obvious, it's direct, it's impactful, and it's personal, right? If everybody wants to live in a community that is greener and cleaner, and certainly more prosperous. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for communities, but it's just a matter of what vehicle they wish to choose.
Yeah, I would certainly echo that. And I think, you know, that's something we've tried to do as an organization, is to raise awareness among the public, but also among, you know, communities, government entities that would have an ability to impact, you know, how consumers decide what they're going to do with their clothing and apparel. And, you know, partnering with, you know, textile recycling companies, you know, at the local landfill, or setting up a textile recycling day. You know, there's a variety of opportunities that don't necessarily have to be curbside, that a community can engage in with, you know, companies that you know, definitely have the markets that can deal with the materials that are collected.
Okay, do you think there's a need for national policies that an organization like NRC could support, or, you know, even the state recycling organizations or state policies that could be supported?
Yeah, I think that you know, that would be a great idea. I think, you know, it's kind of a heavy lift to have that happen, but, you know, we certainly as an organization, you know, welcome any communities that, you know, want to develop a, you know, a system for, you know, not having those materials thrown in landfills. You know, there are a lot of talks, and I'm sure Ira's aware of them as well, you know, the whole end of life, and, you know, is there an extended producer responsibility, some kind of a fee imposed at the time that you purchase clothing that would then go to help with the reuse and recycling of it at the end of its life. Those are certainly things we want to be engaged in as an association and for our members. But, you know, because the U.S. particularly is such a big country, and, you know, you're not just talking states, you're talking cities and towns that, you know, would have to be on board. And then the other big lift in all of that is getting the apparel manufacturers and retailers to buy into that. And, you know, I think that's an opportunity for the future, definitely.
Right. We saw that recently in the UK. I don't know if it was not front page news here, but there was an effort by members of parliament to pass a tax, a penny tax, on every article sold to promote end-of-life recovery or recycling, and that was summarily dismissed. Yeah. So there, it's in the public, you know, it's being discussed, it's being considered, but it's not likely to see. I don't think to see a national or countrywide, you know, enactment anytime soon, unfortunately. And I think it, you know, I think it's hopeful that the brands and the apparel manufacturers will self-police, but I mean, it's really about whether consumers take notice, and they have, and whether they're willing to pay for this is a question. In some way, shape, or form, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. All right, I think we're just about out of time, so we're gonna wrap it up here. Again, this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, has been recorded. Will be available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and Recycling Market Center websites. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Jackie and Ira, for taking time out to make your presentation and answer these questions. And we hope everybody will join us for next month's webinar. Please visit the NRC and RMC websites for schedule updates. And have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.